All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to Making the Argument. Today, we've got a very interesting conversation for you because we're going to be talking about the Second Amendment, and specifically, we're going to be talking about an organization that has done a lot of good work in this space. And when I say good work, I don't just mean advocacy, right? I don't just mean making an argument for the Second Amendment. I mean a group that has really found very, very practical ways to defend what is ultimately your right to be able to defend yourself, your family, and a free state. And that's what we're going to be discussing today with Senior Vice President of Gun Owners of America, Erich Pratt. Erich, how you doing?
Doing great, Nick. It's so good to be with you. Thanks for having me today.
No, absolutely. My pleasure. Hey, look, right off the bat, nobody's going to do a better job of explaining what GOA does than you. So do a quick introduction for our audience.
Well, we are the no-compromise gun lobby in Washington, D.C. We are defending our Second Amendment rights, and we're doing it in the courts, in the Congress, all across the states. It's as you and your listeners or viewers know, it is a nonstop battle. But I tell you what, our members and supporters are keeping us on the front lines, and by God's grace, we've been getting a lot of victories in all those arenas, and so it's been an exciting venture to be sure. But anyway, our main goal is to put heat on the legislators, and thankfully, you've never had to feel that from us, Nick, because you're so solid on the Second Amendment. But as you know, a lot of your colleagues are not, and so we marshal the grassroots to put heat on them, and we've just seen time and time again what a difference that makes in terms of protecting our rights.
No, that's absolutely true. And again, I've seen that firsthand in the state legislature here in Virginia. One of the things I wanted to get into today is you guys have, I think it's the first of a kind for your organization, and that's the goals. That's the Gun Owners Advocacy and Leadership Summit that's coming up. And the reason why I want to kind of introduce Gun Owners of America to the audience kind of through the lens of the upcoming conference is not just because I'm going to be there, right? But you guys have got a lot of other John Lovell's going to be there. I think Herrera is going to be there. Yep. Who are some of the other people that are showing up to this?
So John Patton, Lieutenant Governor, that's of the Gun Collective, Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, Dana Lash, who people probably know from the Dana Show.
Yeah.
Lots of great speakers. There'll be some politicians there, but they're the good ones. They're the ones that are defending our rights, like yourself. A lot of we're going to have over 150 vendors. I mean, we are just really excited about this. It's our first ever national convention. We're bringing together the gun industry with great entertainment. Some of the speakers that we mentioned, we're going to have over 120,000 square feet of guns and gear. So it's kind of like a big gun show too, in terms of being able to get gear. Obviously, people won't be able to walk out with guns or ammo, although they can certainly order it. It's free for all GOA members. And if people go to goals.gunowners.org, you can reserve your place there. It's going to be Christmas in August.
That's right. Come on. It was August 17th, 18th?
August 17th and 18th. That's right.
17th and 18th.
Yeah. The who's who of the gun rights movement is going to be there.
Well, and this is one of the reasons why I've always liked GOA. And of course, my business partner and our producer, Nicholas Hamilton, he's done a lot of work for GOA over the past as well. Mm-hmm. And here's what it really comes down to. We did a whole episode a while back on what everyone kind of misses or gets wrong about the Second Amendment. And you see this all the time with politicians, even politicians that are supposedly, pro 2A. They always talk about it through the lens of like sporting or, hunting. And the thing that we try to remind people is like, look, the founders hadn't just got back from a really rigorous hunting trip when they wrote the Second Amendment. There was very unique purposes and reasons for why it was placed in there, why they placed such an emphasis on it. If you look at most of your state constitutions, you're also going to find something similar to the Second Amendment. In Virginia, it's Article 1, Section 13 of the Virginia Constitution. And it is rooted around a couple of concepts. One is the individual right to own firearms. Right? It's not this idea that it just belonged to the militia or the government, the individual right to own firearms. And then there was the individual right was necessary because our founders understood that you have, as a free person, you have a right to protect yourself, your property. But then there was also, and this is the part that is missed, and this is the part that destroys this myth that the founders only meant muskets or they only meant, shotguns. It was put in because they considered it integral, essential to the security of a free state. They were actually very, very, suspicious of a large federal government that would be the only ones that had the power to impose its will. And so they wanted an armed and informed citizenry because they believed it was absolutely essential to ensuring that the United States would remain free, whether that threat came from foreign or domestic sources. And a lot of times that gets, that kind of gets cluttered and caricatured in the modern media. So what are some of the ways that you guys have kind of fought back against that caricature of, it's only for muskets, or, you really think you're going to, stand up against the U.S. military, as if we're all sitting around waiting for that day. And we don't want that day to come. But again, our founders put it in there for a reason. Tell us a little bit about what GOA thinks of that purpose and how you go about combating it, not just legislatively, but also in the culture.
Well, I think for one thing, we have to be students of history and remind people of our history, and everything you just laid out. I mean, they didn't just come back from a hunting trip, and no founder ever said, "Oh, look, the deer are coming, the deer are coming," right? They had just fought a war against the most powerful power on the earth, and they won. And it was because they were able to access firearms. And in many cases, they even had better firearms than what the British soldiers had. So, remembering that, and that wasn't the last time, because some people like to paint that as, oh, that's just a bunch of white guys in wigs and tall stockings running through the woods. We need to remember our history, that even up into through the 20th century, in the civil rights movement, there were many, many examples of the Black community using firearms, where the Southern racist police departments were in cahoots with the KKK and were just simply not protecting them. And they were using firearms to protect themselves. And there are some very dramatic cases of that. I love, Condoleezza Rice, who was a former Secretary of State with George Bush. She talks about how her dad, back in the 1960s, used to patrol the neighborhood with other Black gentlemen in the neighborhood, and they were armed, and they would patrol their neighborhoods to keep their neighborhoods safe against attacks from the KKK. So, and of course, all the way, I mean, we even see this on the world stage, right? I mean, the attack in Israel this past October, or what Ukraine is having to go through. I mean, these governments, once those attacks happen, it's like, oh, snap, we have to change things. And they start making it easier for their citizens to have guns, whereas beforehand they had been very restrictive. And so, when we come back to remembering what the Declaration of Independence says, that our rights come from God. Okay, that's Exhibit A. That's really important. So then when you get to the Constitution and the Second Amendment, and you say, you see that right to keep and bear arms, they're not giving it to us. They're not granting it to us. They say that right that exists shall not be infringed. And that's why at Gun Owners of America, we oppose all and any kinds of infringements, permits, waiting periods, bans. I mean, you name it, they're all infringements. And, the consequences are dire. You see that with Israel, where they had limited people to either not having firearms or maybe having one handgun and 50 rounds of ammunition. That was it. On October 7th, that was it.
That's something I could speak to, because we visited one of the kibbutz, which was about, I think it was less than 3 kilometers from the border with Gaza. And one of the questions that we asked is like, well, okay, again, Israel has compulsory service. So just about it's 2 years for women, 3 years for men. There's certain people within the Orthodox community that have been exempt, but that's now even changing. And so it's been this idea where people in Israel are very, very familiar with being around firearms. By the same token, they don't have, a Second Amendment like we do that allows for easy individual ownership like that. And one of the questions that we ask is like, okay, but the kibbutz has security, right? And for those that don't know, think of the kibbutz as kind of like a collective, right? Almost like a little bit like a commune that usually surrounds either, it might be agriculture, it might be a particular industry, but it's all these people kind of living in this close, tight-knit community. And they're like, yes, we have security with the kibbutz. Okay, so where was the security? Well, they had to go to the armory to get their firearms. I said, okay, so did they not get there in time? Were they not sure? And they're like, well, you need to understand is that this particular kibbutz actually had a very good working relationship with a lot of workers from Gaza, and they would regularly go and bring them in under worker programs, and they would assist and they would do stuff. And the working theory is that some of them were there to identify where the armory was. And so at certain kibbutz that were attacked, when Hamas came in, they made a beeline for the armory. And I remember asking the question, I said, is there going to be any changes with respect to people having access to firearms? And they said that this is one of the things that we're seriously considering. And obviously that has to go through a legislative process. She wasn't at liberty to tell me what all the story was from that. But it goes back to this idea that, again, when you deny someone the ability to defend themselves, I tried to make this point to one of my colleagues on the floor of this last session in the General Assembly. None of us want bad things to happen, right? None of us want somebody to use a firearm for a nefarious, murderous, or evil purpose. Nobody wants that. But from the government, we are limited with respect to what outcomes we can assure, right? I can't ensure the outcome will be the one I want. If you say nobody gets guns, that doesn't mean nobody gets guns. What it means is you have an incredibly high probability that people that follow the law will not have them, and people that don't follow the law you might make it a little bit more difficult for them to find one or access one. I said, so that's what you've got. That you're infringing on everybody's rights in the hope that it will make it more difficult for a bad guy to use a firearm, right? Because they don't have any compunction about breaking the law. I said, but here's what I can guarantee, right? Here's the only thing you can guarantee by passing that legislation is everybody who does want to follow the law has now been put in a very, very vulnerable situation when somebody tries to use a firearm against them. That's what you guarantee. You don't guarantee the other thing. You don't guarantee the thing for the bad guy. You guarantee the thing for the private citizen that simply wants to defend themselves, their family, etc. And it is almost like it doesn't compute, right? Or at least that's what I used to think. I used to think, well, this just doesn't compute. For some of them now, I don't think that's what it is. I think they like the idea of a society that is completely dependent on the state for their own security. Is this something that you see all over the country? Because I see it in Virginia.
Yeah. And you're right. Years ago, I've been with GOA fighting for over 30 years. And initially, I think folks on the other side, many of them just had a mistaken idea, thinking that, well, if they restricted the guns or took away the guns, that would make society safer. You're absolutely right that the leftist mentality has grown so much since then. It is an all-consuming ideology, and they really do want us to be dependent upon the state. Boy, and if you want just an example of how relying on the government for your protection doesn't work, Secret Service has one job: protect one guy, right? And when they can't even do that right, how are they going to protect millions of people and keep them safe? Yeah. You're absolutely right. That is the mentality that's taken hold, and it's bigger than just guns and them wanting to defend us. I mean, you were even hearing, why, they want re-education camps for, older people like us, Nick, who don't think right. They obviously want to control the schools and brainwash the kids. I mean, it is an all-encompassing ideology. I think very few times now is it just the mistaken idea that, if we just control some of these objects, then we'll be safer, because there's so much evidence to the contrary. I mean, we've tried so many things. Let's face it. I mean, all across this country, different states. I mean, look at Chicago, look at Baltimore. I mean, these are some of the most restrictive cities in our country, and yet they're the most dangerous. It's obviously not working. And then they'll say, well, that's just because bad guys are getting guns from the places next door where it's much easier to get the guns. And I always fire back at them and say, well, then why aren't the guns a problem there? If they're getting the guns in Indiana, why isn't Indiana a hellhole and a shooting gallery? Why is it only in Chicago that the guns become a problem? Oh,
Yeah.
well, maybe it's because the people in Chicago are dissuaded from protecting themselves, and the bad guys in Chicago aren't really being dealt with and are being thrown out back out into the streets. See, I mean, this is the problem. It's a huge problem that's more than just what we're talking about here. But yeah, that ideology, it's a deep, all-encompassing ideology where they just want us to be dependent on the state.
Well, and I think it's important for people to understand too that it's like sometimes people will hear that and the thought that automatically goes for the mind is, oh, they're just evil tyrants. It's like no. It's not as if they're sitting there like cackling and rubbing their hands together, looking in a mirror, going, ha ha ha, I will dominate society. They honestly believe that people just need to be micromanaged by wise people within the government, by experts, right? By the people with noble intentions, by the people who are qualified, by the people who have the proper certifications. And of course, they're going to control through higher education and other institutions who has access to that. And those, but once they're in place, well, then of course, this is how can we possibly achieve the sort of utopia that we, of course, all want to have if we don't have this kind of order coming from, a strong centralized government? And again, so it's important to understand. I don't want to make a caricature of it. I want to steel man the argument, but essentially what this comes down to is that if you've bought into this philosophy that what really makes society prosperous and safe is a strong central authority that's essentially managing society to achieve equity, well then yeah, you having the means to push back against that is not acceptable. In fact, it's an existential threat to that end state.
Exactly.
And so it doesn't matter that you can point out all day long that the people with the highest degree of gun ownership are the least likely to actually commit crimes with those guns. It doesn't matter that the areas which actually focus more on supporting law enforcement and putting violent people away don't have the same issue with guns. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because ultimately you possessing that capability means that at some point you could decide that you are going to fight back, and that's not acceptable because that makes you a threat to democracy. But let me ask you this. One of the things that I've appreciated about GOA is that for all the work that you do in the legislature, and I appreciate how much work you do in state legislatures, because I honestly think that is one of the we get so focused on the federal, people don't recognize that the vast majority of the gun laws that they're dealing with or the infringements on their essential civil liberties happen at the state level. And so that fight is very important. But you guys also fight within the cultural space. Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit about some of the programming that you guys do? I mean, part of the reason why you guys are doing goals is not just to inform them about, the legislative process, but that gun ownership is a responsibility. And it's a fun one, right? It is a fun responsibility, but it's also an important one, and it's one that has to be handled with a certain degree of respect. So talk a little bit about the cultural things that you guys do at GOA and maybe some of the stuff that we can expect to see at the conference coming up.
Absolutely. Summit. And we should mention that the conference goals is in Knoxville, Tennessee. And again, it's August 6th, 17th and 18th. And if you just go to goals.gunowners.org, you can register and sign up for that. We'd love to see you there. But we are involved in the culture, and a lot of that you're going to see at the Goals Conference. We also want to be activating people, make them better activists. And so that's going to be a theme that is there. In addition to all the fun and the entertainment and the music, there's going to be a message and encouragement to become better activists or get others to be better activists. But, to your question about, how are we affecting the culture? I mean, everything from social media to going to speaking colleges and high schools to, I mean, my goodness, we even are on TikTok, but trying to reach as many people as we can. Nick, as a Christian, as you are, I mean, we've tried to appeal to believers to understand that this is an important issue for them, and to speak to that issue. And so we've spoken in churches. We've had seminars on what does the Bible have to say about weapons and weapons control, things like that. So, I mean, this is a very holistic approach that we're taking. In addition to fighting in the legislatures and in the courts, I mean, we're also trying to educate people so that, that not only themselves, but then the people that they come into contact with, and especially, as parents and grandparents, that they would pass that on to the next generation and the generation after them, these important truths that we're talking about here, which really are life-changing.
Well, and I think I'd like to do a follow-up episode on the whole concept of the faith or the moral argument here, because I think it's an important one that sometimes gets missed. But it really is fundamental. And I would say in part because, obviously the gun is the tool, right? And the tool is neither moral or immoral. It's as good or as bad as the person that's utilizing it.
Right.
And I had to explain this to somebody once. I had somebody going like, why do you guys have such an obsession with guns? And I said, I think that's a core part of the problem is you think the obsession is with guns. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm sure there's some people that are, right? And I certainly think they're cool, right? I got a lot. But, I mean, I don't have any. They all went in a fishing accident. But anyways, the reason why this issue is so important to us is because you see it as a discussion about a tool. We see it as a discussion about essential civil liberties.
Exactly. It's about freedom.
And that is a fundamental difference. And part of it goes to the historical component that you mentioned before, is that whenever we look back on history and we ask the question, right, if we're really going to buy into this whole idea of kind of the classical liberal view of, we don't want tyrants, we don't want authoritarians, we don't want, absolute monarchs. We want a society, a government of, by, and for the people. We want a society that actually encourages and ensures freedom, not just to vote, but to live our lives. We don't see how that is possible long term. We don't see how you effectively sustain that when the private citizens that the government and everything else is supposed to be for is completely at the mercy of the state, out of a select group of people with political power for their own security. Can you please explain it? Can you please show me a point in history where that's ever been able to be sustained long term? And they want to give like recent examples. Oh, well, the UK confiscated guns. Yeah, like what, less than 3 decades ago? Well, Australia did this. Yeah, less than 3 decades ago. And by the way, you look at what's going on in the UK right now. You can get arrested for praying quietly in front of abortion clinic. They've had 33 people, I think it's 3,300 people in the UK arrested for things they tweeted. And we're not talking about, I'm going to blow up Parliament. We're, saying something like that that's, clearly illegal. We're talking about somebody that said something that somebody else found offensive, right? You go look at what the COVID protocols looked like in Australia, where they're running people down in an empty park and handcuffing them to throw them in jail because they violated COVID laws. Right? Look, if you can't actually, not to mention the fact, and keep in mind, what did I just point out? I just pointed out the UK and Australia, right? I didn't point out Nazi Germany. I didn't point out, Mussolini's Italy. I didn't point out Stalinist Russia. I could have gone to those examples, which would have been every bit as relevant, right? But it's even examples like the UK and Australia, ones that they want to hold up as like, well, these are still very, very free societies. Guys, look, Reagan had it right when he said that freedom is not passed down to future generations in the bloodstream, right? It has to be explained. It has to be properly understood so that future generations know why they're protecting it and know why they have to have the mechanisms that allow them to be able to protect it on a very practical level. One of the things that you guys do on the educational front that I appreciate and something that I think people should take advantage of is, equipping people with the understanding that being an activist is not just, going out and calling your legislator. That's not all it is. If you really want to be something that fights for this, you actually educate other people on what it actually means to own a firearm and what that responsibility as a free citizen to own a firearm is. I love to take people shooting, right? I love to take people shooting. And I've had people over to my home before because we've got enough acreage and we've got a little range set up. And one of the things I've noticed is I had a young elementary school teacher out there, and she had fired a shotgun like once or twice in her life. And I remember taking her, I said, okay, what would you like to shoot? And it's not like she was anti-gun or pro-gun. It wasn't a big factor in her life. And so we fired a .22 pistol, right? And then we fired a 9mm pistol. And then we fired a .22 rifle. And then we fired a shotgun. And then I broke out the AR, right? And she fired the AR. And the look on her face, she's like, ooh, I like that one. What has been your experiences with people that maybe they're anti-gun, or maybe they just didn't know, maybe they had some fear associated with it, and taking them out to shoot for the first time? Like, share some of your guys' experience or GOA's experiences with doing things like that.
Absolutely. And I think, Nick, what you just shared should be an encouragement to everybody who's watching, because, we may not have the money of CNN or some of these, NBC, and it's easy to get dispirited and think, well, I don't have the reach. But what you did in having somebody over to your home, you can dispel the myths and basically inoculate them against what they're going to be seeing. And we've seen that very dramatically. In fact, my daughter wanted to take one of her friends out, and so she asked me to come along so I could do a little briefing, gun safety, et cetera. And we went to the range. And Nick, I was going to do the same thing, start with the .22 and move up. Unfortunately, at first, we never got there because we were at an indoor range, and you may get on me saying that wasn't the smartest thing to do, because there were some guys there in the the stalls next to us that had some big beastly firearms, and when they shot it, it wasn't pop, pop, pop. It was boom, boom, right? And you could feel it through the partition. And this gal, I am not lying, she ran out of there in tears.
Really?
I'm like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do now? My daughter, thankfully, is just the most graceful person on the planet. She ran out after her, talked to her. I mean, this was like a 15-minute process. Finally, brings her back in, and she's ready to go again. And we did. We started at the .22 and worked our way up all the way to the end. I don't think I had an AR that day with me, but she loved my .38 Smith & Wesson, which is like a old police issue firearm. And at the end, she wanted to be pictured with it, and she loved it. Well, when we got to the car, this is where, she says, Eric, I just want to let you know what happened in there. She said, and I just, really appreciate what, you and your daughter have done. But when I heard those other guns going off, she said, it brought back to mind the mass shooting stories that I've seen on TV. And it just shook me. Now, mind you, she's never been a victim of anybody using a firearm against her. Nobody in her family. This was all just her conditioning from watching the news stories. And it was like she was going through PTSD. I mean, she was having an episode. But let me tell you, that day after firing all those different firearms, she left the anti-gun camp and now understands, because she's had personal experience with it. And so that's why I say, the other side with their big megaphones, they do reach a lot of people, but it won't compete to a friend or a family member saying, hey, come over to the house, or hey, let's, go out, to a farm and, shoot off some rounds. And, if, friends or family, I mean, they usually don't turn down that thing. That is so key and so impactful. So, I think that is a real key, Nick, in terms of changing hearts and minds on this issue.
Well, I think it's important too that parents understand, and I think most of us in this community we get it. Like, I grew up with firearms. I always tell people firearms were never scary to me. Me mishandling a firearm was terrifying because my father or my grandfather would have just tore me up. But they started it from a very young age. It was about understanding and having respect, right? This is one thing that I think is so important, is that we're not treating this issue. Yeah, we make funny jokes at times and stuff like that. But you go watch people that care about this issue, that take it seriously, that train. They always handle the weapon with respect. And whenever they're training other people, they do it with respect. And I think that's an important component, because I know that my kids, the first time my kids shot, they were, I think, about 5 years old. 5 years old was the first time we took out .22 pistol and we shot. And part of what that was, it was getting used to the noise. It was getting used to, how do we properly handle, where do we stand? What are the safety components to this? Because you're right. When you have kids that their only interaction with firearms has been hearing, the press or politicians or Hollywood starlets just, act as if the gun just jumps off the table and starts killing people. Right. They really do have this idea that is this incredibly sensitive object that if you're not careful, it's going to shoot somebody all by its lonesome. And the fear of the unknown, especially when you are talking about a tool which is dangerous, right? The tool itself can be used for dangerous purposes. If you're not then exposing them to it, and you're not then showing well, this is the proper use and this is how to do it. And I want to draw an analogy here. I want you to imagine that a student, right, a younger person's only interaction with vehicles, with a car, was night after night hearing about that this year, once again, more people die on the roads because of vehicular accidents than died in the entire Vietnam War. Right. Once again, another year where we have another vehicular, whole family wiped out by a vehicle, another mass cal event as a result of vehicles. And you never let them, you never let them drive in a car. You never let them sit in a car. You never took them to the car show, right? Like nothing. All it is this constant drumbeat of this is dangerous. And for anybody that thinks, well, that's different. Ladies and gentlemen, I got news for you. The fact that we let 16-year-olds get behind the wheel of a 2-ton pickup truck and then go racing 70 miles per hour down the highway is something that when you think about it, you're like, holy crap. We don't even, in Virginia, they're not even legally allowed to use a tanning bed, but 2 tons going down the interstate at 70, right? But think about it. If you change the whole dynamic and their only interaction was casualty stats and drunk drivers and, entire families being wiped out in car accidents, well, of course they would be like, this is terrifying. I don't want anything to do with it. But we don't do that. What do? We hopefully treat kids from an early age like, look, you get in the car, you drive some. It's practical use. There's a tool for it. There's a purpose for it. But it needs to be handled with respect. And it needs to be handled with respect, not just for your safety, but for the safety of people around you. And yet we treat firearms like, no, this only has one purpose. It's a weapon of war. It's there to kill people. And it is a completely intellectually dishonest and disingenuous way to talk about it. And so I would just encourage, again, if you're an adult and you're curious about this, showing up to something like this summit, right, where you get to listen to people talk about it, you get to hear people explain it, talking about it in a respectful way. But I know one of the most valuable things I ever did, and I've tried, again, another thing I've tried to explain to my fellow legislators. I said, I have firearms. Well, what about kids in the house? I'm like, yeah, I have 3 kids. I've had a lot of firearms since they were very little. Weren't you terrified? No, I was responsible. I taught them how to, just like I wasn't terrified of my 14-year-old or my 15-year-old or my 16-year-old stealing my keys and driving down the road without my knowledge, right? I exposed them to it from a position of respect. And so I didn't have to worry about them because we did it correctly.
Right.
But if you're not doing that with your kids, please don't believe that you have somehow magically protected them, as a result of keeping them in the dark or making them afraid. You haven't. You've put them at a horrible disadvantage. Right. And it's something, and this is something I want to get into as well with you, because my wife pointed this out when she ran for office. she said, we have all these talks about rape culture. We have all these talks about the Me Too movement. We have all these talks about women being vulnerable and being victims of domestic violence. She goes, how can the same people talk about all of those concerns within society and then want to systematically disarm women or keep them from being able to have the one tool that can make them the equal of a much stronger attacker? Right? Tell us a little bit about some of the work that you guys do on this, on outreach to female shooters, and to, again, getting them more comfortable with why this is such an important part for their individual and personal security.
Oh, it's huge. And that is something that you're absolutely right, Nick, we've been involved with. We have a whole division within GOA called Empowered 2A, and it's led by Antonia Cover, and that is one of her main focuses. Is she travels around the country and has free for GOA members training seminars, and training women how to be comfortable with firearms, how to use a firearm, and we consider that crucial. We also, in fact, just this weekend coming up in a few weekends, will be one in Detroit with a guy named Rick Ector, and we've assisted him on a yearly basis for over 10 years. But he puts on a free seminar at a range, and he'll get 1,000 to 2,000 women over the weekend coming in and getting trained. I mean, it is a fantastic thing. And so, that's something that is huge. And it's just so ironic when you hear the leftists in the Congress, because to a T, they are just parroting this line that, a gun is actually going to be more harmful, which is actually very demeaning. By the way, it's like, you can't handle this, you need to leave it to the experts. But, it's the Debbie Wasserman Schultzes of the Congress. I mean, they will actually make this claim that you're actually less safe having a firearm when that's clearly not the case. I mean, you just look at, the government statistics, CDC from years ago, 2013. This was even during the Obama administration. And they found that between 1.5 million and 3 million times every year, guns are used in self-defense. So when you compare that to the number of actual times that guns are being used in an illegitimate way, you see that guns are actually being used 16 to 100 times more often to save life than to take life. But the left ignores those kinds of raw data, and they just make this claim that you're and maybe they'll find one anecdote. I mean, one of their favorites is, if you're a woman and you have a gun and you try to use it in self-defense, then the bad guy is going to take it from you and use it on you. I mean, how demeaning is that? I mean, if that's really true, then we should issue guns to bad guys so that we can take the guns from them. If it's just so easy to do, I mean, that would solve the problem.
And here's my question. If the bad guy's there and he's already planning to do something bad to you, how does you having a firearm make that situation worse? Well, he could use the firearm on me. He was already going to do something bad. He already had the physical strength or some other mechanism in order to do something bad. Like my situation has not necessarily gotten worse as a result of this. And what you're proposing to me is that theoretically, if he could get it, that would be better than you just starting out vulnerable. I'll tell you this much. I don't see many of them, wanting to agree to those sort of terms for themselves, right? It's always fine if it's somebody else, but never for themselves, because they have armed security paid for by tax dollars. But you bring up something important there, because I want to talk a little bit about the stats. Because I've brought this up before too, is that when you look at the most conservative estimate I've ever seen coming out of I think it was the CDC at one point, was 500,000 a year, 500,000 private gun ownership uses in order to prevent a crime. And then you will see the press come out and be like, oh, that's ridiculous. It's only like 127. And they're like, well, okay, wait, whoa. 500,000 over here, 127 over here. Like, how do you reconcile that? Well, because the press will say that, well, only 127 people were shot and killed by a private citizen using a firearm to defend themselves. Like, Okay, what about the ones that were shot and weren't killed? Or here's an even better one. How about the far more common occurrence, which is bad guy comes in to break down the door to beat his ex-wife or his girlfriend, and she goes, "You sure about that?" And he leaves.
Right.
See, if you're not going to count that, if you're going to insist that the only stats that matter is when she actually has to pull the trigger, you're not being intellectually honest, and you're doing it on purpose. But here's the other crazy part about stats, and I brought this up before. If you look at the way the anti-gun crowd uses stats, let's use the domestic violence scenario. So guy comes over and he's drunk again, and he's there to beat up his girlfriend, right? And he comes in and she has a firearm this time, and she shoots him and he dies. All right, that's one scenario. Scenario 2 is she can't get a firearm. She wasn't able to get her permit, or she lives in a place where they put a lot more restrictions and waiting periods. So he comes over and he beats her to death. The gun statistics look better for the left. The gun statistics look better for them if she dies getting beat to death than if he dies getting shot in self-defense. Think about that for a moment and then ask yourself, are they really trying to create a safer community, or are they really just selectively targeting a particular tool or instrument? Because that is unconscionable. The fact that you could stand up there with all this bravado that the Shannon Watts of the world does and say, look at all these gun statistics, and then you look a little bit closer and you're, well, wait a second. Are you honestly saying it would have been better for this woman to be beaten to death? Are you honestly saying it would have been better if that shop owner would have been shot? Are you honestly saying it would have been better simply because your gun stats would have improved? I want a genuinely safe community, not one that's been arbitrarily made to look so because of the manipulation of statistics.
And Nick, you raise a great point that, at the core of what you're saying, gun control actually makes women less safe. And, you look at example of Carol Bound in New Jersey, very tragic. I mean, I can give you tons of examples of exactly what you're talking about, where women did protect themselves with a firearm against an abuser. But in this case, Carol Bound was dating a guy who was a pretty bad guy, and she finally broke it off. And I'm sure her family said, hallelujah. Well, he wasn't happy about that and was threatening her. And so she went to get a firearm because she wanted to protect herself. But unfortunately, in New Jersey, they have all these extra background checks and requirements. And so can be a several week process. And it certainly was for her. And so she's waiting week after week. I think it was even more than a month, still no word. And she wanted to be legal and by the book, so she didn't go buy one on the street. Well, while she's still waiting for permission to be able to purchase a firearm, her ex-boyfriend, who was a felon, shows up in her driveway. And by the way, he didn't need a gun to assault her. He just had a knife. And he cut her up and knifed her to death. And it was just the most tragic thing, because here's a woman who could have protected herself. Again, so many examples of women who have done just that. Broken it off with a guy, and the guy still keeps coming around, and they're angry and they're throwing things around, and now they're threatening them and they want to hurt them, but they have a firearm and they're able to protect themselves. Not in Carol Bound's case. And thank you, by the way, for correcting the stats. The CDC stats, as they examined many different studies, it was 500,000 to 3 million cases of self-defense every year. I think I misspoke earlier. So it's a wide range, but many of those self-defense cases are exactly what you were laying out, Nick, that they didn't all result in person pulling the trigger and then dead bad guy. In many cases, it just simply involved brandishing the fire. In fact, about 90% of the time or more, simply brandishing the firearm is enough to dissuade the attack.
Well, and you think about it as well. This is, again, where the stats manipulation really comes into play. Think about it if they did actually get their way. So let's use the low number, 500,000. 500,000 times a year, a crime was prevented from taking place, or maybe prevented from manifesting itself in the way that it would have because somebody had a firearm. You take the firearm away. are the politicians who pass the laws, are they now responsible for, let's say, theoretically 500 additional victims?
They should be.
They should be, but will they ever be held to account based off of that criteria? Absolutely not, because the way that they're focused on looking on this is gun bad, take it away. It's never about understanding the comprehensive nature of the discussion that we're really engaging in, which is free people are allowed to defend themselves. If you take away their mechanism for defending themselves, if you as a politician take it away, then yes, you are responsible for what happens. You're not responsible. By the way, this is a very important point. And again, something I've tried to explain to my colleagues. You are not responsible for how somebody uses a freedom inappropriately, right? I don't have to bring the speed limits down to 5 miles per hour because some people crash, right? If somebody speeds, if somebody drives recklessly, I am not to blame because they had the freedom to drive recklessly, right? But if I take their car away from them and now they can't get to work and they lose their house, and there's a whole train of things, there's a whole series of consequences that take place as a result of the government actively going in and saying, you don't get this anymore because we've decided it's not safe for you.
Right.
And they never see their responsibility on that side of it. But in a free society, that is the first place you should start. The first place you should start is not, how do I correct all of the world's problems by restricting the freedoms of free people? That's not how you start. You start off with, how do I ensure that I'm not infringing on essential rights, on essential civil liberties? How am I ensuring that we're fostering the sort of society where people have the means and the capability to provide for themselves and, yes, defend themselves, because we know the state's not always going to be there?
So let me give you an example that makes the point to a T. How we don't restrict the freedoms of the law-abiding. You know, it's often said you can't yell fire in a crowded theater when there is no fire. And that is true. However, that doesn't mean that when people are going to the theater that we gag them in order to prevent them from yelling fire, right? No, If somebody yells fire and there is no fire, the individual gets punished. And it should be. It's ironic because people who hate the Second Amendment always use that example, and they don't realize the glaring error or contradiction that they're presenting, because really that's how we should treat the Second Amendment, is that you should be free, if you are a law-abiding person, free to exercise your rights without infringement. That's what the Second Amendment says. But if you abuse that right, then that's the job of government to punish those who do wrong. I mean, that's classic. How we protect liberty and freedoms is you punish the wrongdoer. You don't put straitjackets on all the law-abiding to make sure that they don't step out of line.
No, it's absolutely true. I had this conversation with another show called The Shepherdess, and that was one of the points we brought up, is that do we really want to live in a society where when a relatively small fraction of the population abuses their rights, the rights of everybody else are now forfeit? Because if you do, you don't live in a free society anymore. And think about that. You're also creating this perverse incentive process where if you want a right to go away, then all you have to do is convince somebody else to violate it. And now you have the legal justification to take it from everybody else. And it has reached a level of absurdity. And the part that I do find encouraging is I do think that more people are actually willing to step up now and say, no, you need to understand there are certain lines you're not allowed to cross. And if you do cross it, you will not be met with my gentle compliance. I don't want to fight, right? I don't want to rebel. I don't want to resist. I don't want to have to do any of those things. I just want to be free, right? But if you're going to insist that I can't be, well, then you force me to be able to defend my rights and to do so in a responsible way, right? And to do so in as far as it's within my power to do so in a peaceful way. That's what we want. But it is amazing how so many people on the left who apparently hate the concept of firearms in the hands of private citizens certainly don't mind it in the hands of the very government that they're now going to use to confiscate or impose or to take away. And so it is hypocritical. I pointed out before, the left, the anti-gun group is not anti-gun. They're anti-you having guns. They have no problem with the state having guns. And I just want to point out, if we're gonna go ahead and like just make an empirical argument where we stack up statistics in order to determine who's the greater threat with a firearm, I can promise you this much. The government has a far worse track record over history than private citizens do with respect to the abuse of firearms for nefarious or malevolent purposes. Well, look, we're running up here on the cap. I can't thank you enough, Eric. I really appreciate the work that you do, specifically the work that GOA does. I really do think that your organization is one where whenever people ask me, like, what do I do about this? It's like, look, there's a lot of stuff you can do as an individual, but your voice is always louder when it's actually part of a group that understands what they're doing, how to do it, how the system works, how the legal system works. And GOA is certainly one of those organizations to team up with if this is an important issue for you. Can just to close out here, give us once again the information for the Goals Summit that's coming up and how people can learn more about that.
Absolutely. So if you go to goals.gunowners.org, that's where you can register for the Knoxville event. It's August 17th to 18th, and we would love to see you there. If you just go to gunowners.org, you can find out more information about GOA, sign up, become a member, sign up for our free email alerts, because that's really what makes a difference. I mean, you were talking, Nick, about, we don't want to get to that end point where we're having to bear arms to defend our freedoms against tyrannical government. We want to go through peaceful means, and that's why GOA is here and why we put heat on legislators. And you know what? In this past year, we've repealed a gun ban that was applied to military veterans. We've cut the ATF funding by $122 million, and it's been glorious to hear the leftists like Senator Durbin saying, but that's going to keep them from enforcing gun control. And to which we say that's the point. But see, so in other words, we are making things safer for people so that we don't have to get to that end result. That's why GOA is here, to repeal gun control one step at a time. And if we can't do it in the Congress, we're doing it through the courts. And so that's why, it's just, we really need, the more people that we have backing us, the louder voice that we have in Congress, and the more court cases that we can be taken around the country.
Yeah, the court piece of this cannot be underestimated. I feel like the gun movement has finally gotten good, along with some other organizations, have finally gotten good at taking them to court, because that was always something. Well, look, we don't want to be in court. We want to be living our lives, raising our families, running our businesses. We don't want to, but we have to be if we actually want to fight for this stuff. And I'm going to bring up one other point as we close out here. I have personally watched as the same people that came before the subcommittee that I used to chair on we called it Gun Sub in the General Assembly, Virginia General Assembly. I have watched as those same people that sat there and told us that if we didn't want to engage in gun confiscation, not just regulation, not just the stuff that they tell you in the campaign commercials, if we didn't want to engage in gun confiscation or other severe restrictions of your Second Amendment rights, we didn't care if people died. And then I watched those same legislators walk over to the Courts of Justice Committee and carry legislation to let people that had actually used a firearm to rob, to steal, to assault, to murder, with bills to let them out of jail early. So don't let anybody tell you that this is actually about public safety.
Right.
Because the bottom line is, if it really was, those two things would never happen. I might not agree with them in this committee, but if they walked over to courts of justice and then said, well, no, we also need to make sure that we're enforcing the law, but they don't. And there's a reason for that. So thank you, Eric. Thank you to GOA for all the work you do, for all the very, very practical work that you are doing. Go out to Goals. Go on there. Go on the website. Sign up for that. I'm planning to be there all day Saturday and part of the day Sunday. I think I'm speaking on a panel and some other stuff there. So come on out. Like I said, there's John, our good buddy John Lovell, is going to be there. He's a great guy, along with Brendan Herrera and others. This really is going to be a fun time. You're going to enjoy it. It's not just going to be informative. It really is going to be a great time. So coming out to that, once again, thank you for watching, and we will see you next episode.